Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has announced support measures for businesses. This as Asian countries brace for the impact of US President Donald Trump's so-called Liberation Day tomorrow, when he's set to roll out a fresh volley of tariffs. The Japanese leader says around 1,000 consultation centers will be set up. He has pledged government help for small and mid-sized businesses to get funds and secure an exemption. Mr. Ishiba also says he is not ruling out countermeasures in response to the 25% duties earlier imposed on Japanese autos and auto parts. Auto tariffs from the US are expected to deal a blow to Japan's export-reliant economy. Japanese automakers generate a major chunk of their revenue from North America. Pressure is building for Tokyo to act, given concerns of an economic crisis and waning public trust in Mr. Ishiba's ruling party. And preparations also in South Korea, with acting President Han Duck-soo saying his government is looking at measures to help businesses cope with the impact of tariffs. This amid worries that South Korea's auto industry could also take a hit. Now, according to a survey by the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry, more than half of domestic manufacturing firms say they are likely to be impacted by levies, either directly or indirectly. In terms of response, most say they are still monitoring developments, while others are exploring internal measures, such as cutting production costs. The KCCI adds that manufacturers could face serious damage if they also take into account what it calls China's price competition. But ahead of the announcement, the US president sought to play down the extent of the duties.
Whatever they charge us, we charge them, but we're being nicer than they were. We have a lot of countries, friend and foe. I always say friend and foe, but the friend in many cases is worse than the foe. They took advantage of us, and we are going to be very nice by comparison to what they were. The numbers will be lower than what they've been charging us, and in some cases maybe substantially lower, but we sort of have a world obligation perhaps. But we're going to be very nice. Relatively speaking, we're going to be very kind.
The U.S. administration has pledged to impose levies to match the duties other countries charge on American products, as well as to counteract non-tariff barriers. The details of the plan remain unclear. The White House says any nation that threatens the U.S. unfairly should expect to be targeted. And for more, Pushan Dutt, who is a professor of economics at INSEAD, is here to tell us what the fresh round of Trump tariffs could mean for Singapore. Now, Professor, Singapore has a free trade agreement with the US, which eliminates tariffs for our exports to the US. Can the reciprocal tariffs override this agreement, though?
So all this is a little bit of guesswork because all of our heads are spinning because tariffs are being rolled out and then they're being pulled back. But my guess would be that Singapore will not be affected because of the free trade agreement with the U.S. that sort of bounds the tariffs at zero. So there is no sort of, the reciprocity already exists. The second thing is Singapore actually runs a slight trade deficit with the U.S., so that also insulates it. But having said that, there are indirect risks, and I think the big risk is always the renegotiation of the agreement. Just keep in mind what Trump did with NAFTA. He renegotiated it. It is now called the USMCA, but now as soon as he came into power, he's imposed tariffs in violation of the provisions of it. So there is always a threat of renegotiation. The second big risk is that the trade war is expanding to these non-trade parts as well. So he's already raised this issue of the VAT in the European Union as that being unfair to U.S. goods and U.S. companies. The risk Singapore faces is that, in many of the sectors, the government gives lots of tax breaks and investment incentives. If he wants these companies, these industries like semiconductors and biopharma back in the U.S., then he might start including them in the negotiations, and then that would have an adverse effect on Singapore.
And if these reciprocal tariffs do override the agreement, what recourse might Singapore have?
So I think the recourse that it has, we can think of it in the short run and sort of in the medium to long run. So in the short run, there are basically a few models out there in terms of dealing with the tariffs which are coming in. One model is the Mexican model, which is just to stay quiet and acquiesce. Then there is the Canada, EU, China model, where they threaten retaliation as well. And finally, there's the Australian model, where Australia actually protested the tariffs on steel and aluminum, but they did not impose a lot of tariffs. So I think my guess is that the Australian model actually works better for a small open economy like Singapore, because if Singapore, A, does not have a lot of room for retaliation in the sense it can't really affect its negotiating position. Tariffs, if Singapore imposes retaliatory tariffs, these are actually bad for Singapore. So therefore, Singapore should consider other things, which is like, pivoting more towards trade with its neighboring countries. Two of the fastest growing and biggest countries, China and India, are in Singapore's neighborhood. So, pivot regionally. And the second thing to do is to pivot towards services, because the Trump tariffs are targeted at goods trade and not at services trade, and services trade continue to expand, and that's a big part of the Singaporean economy.
And you mentioned earlier, the same as with our trading partners as well. Singapore's other key partners like China, Malaysia and Japan, they're all expected to be hit hard by these reciprocal tariffs. How will we now need to balance our trade deals between the US and also our other partners, as you mentioned?
I think this is where the disruption to actually Singapore will come in. So if I look at the trade to GDP ratio of Singapore, it's 300%. So if there is an all-out trade war between the large economies, like, you were just talking about Japan and, contemplating retaliation, but the big ones like European Union, China, etc., then the trade as a whole will shrink, and this will sort of hurt Singapore. Now, Trump has a list of countries which are called the Dirty 15 because, that's where the imbalances, the bilateral trade imbalances and the tariffs are sort of unbalanced. Many of these are ASEAN countries. So this includes Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. Of course, it includes China, European Union, etc. And these are all the big trading partners of Singapore. So if an all-out trade war, breaks out, then this is going to have like indirect negative consequences on Singapore. So what it has to do is it has to actually start pivoting right now more towards like thinking regionally, thinking locally, and very importantly is to start thinking about, domestic consumption as a source of demand, because it's not clear whether going forward exports are going to be a source of demand for Singaporean production.
Professor Dutt, thank you so much for that update. That was Prashant Dutt, who is Professor of Economics at INSEAD.